present and emerging. I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders we have with us here tonight. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm Melanie Morrison and the Director of the Sydney Peace Foundation, a foundation at the University of Sydney best known for the annual Peace Prize, with laureates and gold medal awardees including fierce freedom of speech champions such as the late John Pilger, leading public intellectual Noam Chomsky, and Julian Assange, who walked free earlier this week after a long and hard fight against his extradition to the US for publishing details of US state crimes. And we have the brilliant legal team with us here tonight who fought so tirelessly for this outcome. Well done. And if they can do it for Julian Assange, they can certainly do it for Jimmy Lai. Peace, media freedom, and freedom of speech are intrinsically connected. In peaceful and accountable societies, there must be transparent mechanisms and courageous people to hold the powers to account and expose the truth. Unfortunately, right now, we are witnessing devastating attacks on journalists and media freedom across the world, not least in Gaza, where Israel's relentless attacks have led to one of the deadliest conflicts for journalists ever recorded. And in somewhere like Hong Kong, which boasted one of the highest degrees of media freedom in 1997 at the time of the handover, we have seen Hong Kong cascade down the press freedom ladder. The case of publisher, entrepreneur, and pro-democracy activist Jimmy Lai has come to symbolise the deterioration of rights in Hong Kong and the crackdown on dissent and peaceful protest. Now I'm delighted to introduce our speakers, and in awe of them all, can barely keep up with their advocacy and also am struggling to understand how they can keep awake after arriving this morning and earlier this week or a few days ago in Australia from overseas. First we have Sebastien Lai, who is Jimmy Lai's son, the renowned pro-democracy campaigner and media entrepreneur who founded Next Digital and Apple Daily, the popular independent Chinese language newspaper in Hong Kong, which was forcibly shut down by Hong Kong authorities in 2021. Jimmy Lai has been imprisoned in Hong Kong since December 2020 and now awaits trial, which could see him spending the rest of his life behind bars. Sebastien is leading the international Free Jimmy Lai campaign to secure his father's release. Caoilfhionn Gallagher KC, a human rights lawyer who for the past 25 years has acted in many of the leading cases in the UK and before European courts on human rights. Her international work includes acting in many cases involving arbitrary detention. She has secured the freedom of imprisoned journalists, peaceful protesters, cartoonists, and human rights defenders in countries worldwide. She is an expert in journalist safety and she leads the international legal teams for Hong Kong publisher and pro-democracy activist Jimmy Lai. And Professor Saul, who we're delighted he can be here tonight after attending a University Senate meeting. Ben is the Challis Chair of International Law at the University of Sydney and the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Ben has practiced in international tribunals, advised governments, NGOs, the UN, and worked in over 35 countries. He is an elected Fellow of the Australian Academy of Social Sciences and formerly an Associate Fellow of the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London and the International Centre for Counterterrorism in The Hague. And moderating today's discussion is Jennifer Robinson. Jen is an award-winning barrister at Doherty Street Chambers in London and a member of the international legal team for Jimmy Lai. She has acted in key human rights and media freedom cases in domestic and international courts. She advises media organisations and journalists on media freedom and journalist safety with clients including BBC World Service, the International Federation of Journalists, and bereaved families of Palestinian journalists, and of course Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And I can't resist, but Jen is also a very fine product of our public education system. Before the panel discussion, there's a trailer that we'd like you to watch from a documentary on the Hong Konger, which is based on the trial of Jimmy Lai.
The future, which is unknown and uncertain, is still unknown for me, but it's certain.
Freedom was a very short journey for me.
He came as basically a refugee from China when he was a teenager.
I was put in the bottom of a fishing trunk, and by the afternoon, we arrived in Hong Kong, and the same night I was taken to a factory to work as a worker. What we eat and sleep in the factory.
He was so poor, not highly educated.
It was a very happy time. It was a time that I know I had a future.
For a Chinese, that's like going from Kansas in black and white to Oz, where everything seems like it's possible.
As long as you wanted to work, you could make it in Hong Kong.
The British gave us the old institutions of freedom.
Freedom of speech, rule of law, poverty, right, freedom of assembly,
And let our resourcefulness flourish.
You went from an incredibly poor city to a metropolis.
So I started a very small factory.
He's a classic entrepreneur.
And then I went into retailing.
Giordano was this huge brand.
If I just go on making money, it doesn't mean anything to me. If I go into the media business, I deliver choice, and choice is freedom.
Apple Daily played a very important role in Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement.
We've never had a territory of 7.5 million people who have lived and breathed the basic freedom, having that taken away from them.
Hong Konger means determination, fearlessness, the belief in human rights.
Mr. Lai insisted on marching in front where the authorities could see him.
I've been arrested 3 times.
The Hong Kong police raided the Apple Daily
It's
compound.
very likely that, I will have to go to prison.
He chose to stay in Hong Kong.
Their house is firebombed.
All I had is faith in me.
I watched this man willingly give up the life of a billionaire to become a dissident.
This is a time for sacrifice. Even if they kill me, I will have to fight to the last day.
He's probably the most famous newspaperman now jailed in the world.
I love freedom of my life.
Okay, so if we could ask the panellists to take their seats. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Jen.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Good evening, everyone. My name's Jen Robinson. I'm a proud member of the legal team for Jimmy Lai and Sebastien Lai. Thank you so much for joining us this evening to talk about his important case. One of the most inspiring stories, I think, that I've heard, and one of the most important, in terms of his personal story and his connection to Hong Kong, but one of the most inspiring and most important cases, I think, of press freedom around the world. So we have an amazing panel. Sebastien, who's been campaigning for his father, Caoilfhionn, my brilliant leader on the case, and an incredible human rights lawyer who's represented incredible people around the world, including Maria Ressa, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for journalism, and Professor Ben Saul, who is a great representative for Australia as UN Special Rapporteur on counterterrorism and human rights. So please join me in welcoming them. Sebastien, I want to start with you and about Dad's story because it is so inspiring. So can you tell us a little bit about his story and why Hong Kong and its freedoms are so important to him?
Yeah, of course. I'll start off with a relatively light-hearted story given how sad the whole situation is. So my father was born in 1947-48 in mainland China, and he doesn't really know when it is, but his mum always tells him that you were born and the communists came right away. So that's how he sort of knows. His father escaped when the communists came, and his mother was put in a re-educational camp because she could read and write. And so at a very young age, he was the man of the family, had to take care of his two sisters. He worked many different manual jobs, including as a hawker, eventually landing in a train station where he'd help people carry bags for tips. And one day, this very well-dressed man gives him a half-eaten bar of chocolate instead of money. Now, Dad had never seen chocolate in his life, but he was very hungry, so he turns around and eats the whole bar. Now, I don't know if you guys remember the first time you've had chocolate, but if you're 9-year-old in China and you're starving, well, it's almost like a religious experience. So he runs after the man and says, "Excuse me, sir, where are you from?" And the man says, "Well, I'm from Hong Kong." And my 9-year-old father thinks, that's a weird time, sorry. My father, who was 9 years old, thinks to himself, well, then Hong Kong must be heaven. And that was the moment he decided to really go to Hong Kong. It was that idea of, going back to the trailer, where for him information was choice and choice was freedom. And that was a very direct image of that, of him decided to go to Hong Kong because of that little piece of chocolate. And then, throughout the years he started Giordano, but his political awakening was, and actually the political awakening of many people in Hong Kong was 1989, the Tiananmen Square massacre. He realized that he needed to do something to protect the freedoms that that his adoptive city gave him. And because of that, he started Apple Daily. He started Next Magazine first, and then eventually Apple Daily.
Can I ask why it's called Apple Daily?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek name, because the apple refers to the apple of Eden. I don't know if you guys know the story of course, the snake tempting the person to eat the apple, and then Adam and Eve got thrown out of Eden. And his point was that the Chinese Communist Party, when he was growing up, always told him that it was the best place in the world. But of course, China was not heaven, and the Chinese Communist Party is not God. And so as a citizen, you had to bite the apple every day and see the truth for what it is.
And so your dad's story is remarkable. He started out as a child, travelled to Hong Kong on his own as a child. How old was he?
11 or 12.
11 or 12, on his own, turns up in Hong Kong, works as a child labourer, works his way up in garment factories to build like a multi-billion-dollar company. But he chooses at that moment, and what was his, in terms of the political trajectory of Hong Kong at that time, he showed quite a lot of foresight, right? Like the purpose of the newspaper was, we knew that Hong Kong was being handed back to China, and what that was going to mean for Hong Kong and the freedoms that people had once enjoyed. And so talk us through his thinking and his vision for Apple Daily and how that played out.
Yeah, so he knew that when Hong Kong was going to be handed over to from the British to the Chinese, that actually a lot of people had already started self-censoring, and a lot of newspapers had already started to bend the knee, so to speak, and long live the king is dead, long live the king. And so he knew that the people of Hong Kong needed a news source that wasn't as afraid to speak truth to power, and had a very independent editorial, and really had a very pro-democracy stance. It was the biggest newspaper in Hong Kong and Taiwan, but more importantly, it was the pro-democracy stance that made it so special. An example of where they did speak truth to power was in 1994, when Li Pang, the butcher of Beijing, the man who ordered the Tiananmen Square massacre, defended his decision in an interview, and Dad penned an op-ed calling Li Pang a Huang Badan, which is a turtle's egg with 0 IQ. As you can expect, Li Pang, who was Premier of China, didn't really like that, and that's why all his stores in China in Beijing were closed, and then he was forced to either apologize or sell Giordano, and he chose the latter because he didn't want to be compromised, and that was one of the sort of funnier stories in Apple Daily, and one of the better examples. But Apple Daily always had this editorial, and my father and his journalists kept doing that till the passing of the national security law, when he was arrested and his colleagues were arrested.
And so I just want to, so your dad was speaking truth to power, and it cost him his business.
Yeah.
Cost him Giordano.
Yeah.
He kept going with Apple Daily. Tell us a bit about how popular Apple Daily was. And became.
Yeah. So Apple Daily was the biggest newspaper in Hong Kong, and actually a story that really illustrates this, and I don't think I'll forget it for the rest of my life, but when the first arrest happened, when they arrested my father for the first time, the next day the people of Hong Kong lined up for the Apple Daily newspaper, and someone was interviewed in line, and they asked him, are you still going to buy Apple Daily now that now that it's practically outlawed? And he turns around and says in Cantonese, "I'll bati du mai," which means I'll buy it even if it was a white piece of paper. And so, for the people of Hong Kong, for many people in Hong Kong, the courage that my father and the journalists displayed was incredibly inspiring, and was also a reminder of what makes Hong Kong great. The courage to pursue what you wanted, the courage to speak out, and the ability to do so under a system that used to have the rule of law and used to have free speech.
I want to ask you one last question before I go to Caoilfhionn to hear about the case, but tell us, how did you find out that your dad had been arrested?
So I had just arrived in Taiwan at that point, and I was still in quarantine when there was a knock on the door at, I think it was 6 in the morning, and they told me that Dad got picked up. Someone had went to our house in Hong Kong with 15 national security law police officers. They ran in, and national security law police officers don't have tags, so you can't identify them. Ran in and then put my dad in cuffs and basically took him away. Before leaving, though, Dad turned around to my family and said to not be afraid. I think he didn't let fear determine the decisions that he was going to make, and I'm truly inspired by that.
I want to come back and talk more about the campaigning that you've been doing, but Caoilfhionn, can you give us an overview of the case itself?
Yeah, of course. So, really what we're seeing here is Jimmy Lai, 76-year-old, brilliant man, as you've seen from the film and got a flavour of from what Sebastian's just said, being targeted because of his work and because of his beliefs. So he's been targeted by the authorities for decades. So ever since 1989, when he was inspired to set up this newspaper company, he was targeted. Look, everyone in the room knows journalists tread on some pretty powerful toes. And Jimmy Lai...
If they're doing their job properly.
Exactly. And Jimmy Lai trod on many powerful toes over the decades. And for that, he was targeted in multiple ways. You've heard about his home being firebombed, his office being firebombed, advertisers being targeted too, so they tried to cripple the newspaper financially too. They attempted to cow him in multiple ways, but it's only in the last 5 years that they've been able to use the most effective weapon of all, which is the law. And Maria Ressa, my client in the Philippines, often refers to what's now happening in authoritarian regimes as lawfare, and that's really what we've seen. So he's faced a series of different lawsuits and cases over the last few years. It's like, that old fairground game of whack-a-mole. It's like a legal version of whack-a-mole, where there's a whole series of different cases he's got to fight. So there's 3 different types of cases. First of all, he was charged with a whole series of different offences related to peaceful protest-related activity. And there were 4 separate sets of proceedings there, and he received sentences, all of which he served, and which have been condemned by the UN Special Rapporteur on Peaceful Assembly, and one of which has already been overturned, in fact, but long after he'd served the sentence. I'll just give you a flavour with one example of just how disproportionate those sentences were. Since 1989, Jimmy Lai every year commemorates the Tiananmen Square massacre. You heard about it being his political awakening. And on one occasion, he went to a vigil in honour of the Tiananmen Square victims. He lit a candle, said a prayer, was there for 15 minutes, and he got a 13-month sentence. So that's a flavour of the kind of thing he's faced. He also then was charged with completely bogus fraud charges over a lease violation, something which would ordinarily be civil at most, condemned by the US government on the day he was convicted. So he's serving that sentence currently. He's got a sentence of over 5 years for that. But now he's facing the most serious charges of all under the national security law. And some of you in the room, I know a number of people in the room will have heard about the national security law. It was brought in 2020, very widely condemned by multiple UN experts, multiple governments worldwide were deeply concerned that the national security law, because it was drafted so vaguely, that essentially criminalises dissent, they were worried that it would be used to crack down on civil society and independent journalism. And I'm afraid to say they've been proven to be absolutely right. And what we're seeing in Jimmy Lai's case now is a man who is facing life behind bars for being a journalist. This is a case which is conspiracy to commit journalism. That's what it is.
And I wonder if you can speak a little bit about how this fits into broader patterns that you're seeing around the world in your practice, that we're seeing in our practice together.
Sure. So Jen and I, as you heard, work in a lot of these cases. And I think there's probably 4 trends that I'd like to pick up from the case. The first one is that increasingly I'm seeing that authoritarian regimes are not only going after individual journalists. I mean, there's of course many heartbreaking cases of individual journalists, take Evan Gershkovich in Russia, for example. But increasingly I'm seeing people in fact targeting media owners and the newspaper itself. And that's really chilling and pernicious because it's an attempt to take out an entire media ecosystem. So we see that with Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. You know, you go in, you have hundreds of police officers raiding the building, you terrify all of the journalists. And bear in mind, what's happened here really is state-sponsored theft of a hugely successful media company, of a hugely successful business. Apple Daily's already closed down. The printing presses have stopped before the national security law trial has even finished. But there's other examples of that too. I mean, the targeting of Maria Ressa in the Philippines has been targeting Maria Ressa and Rappler. Similar ethos, also a newspaper which was set up from the outset, being pro-human rights, anti-corruption, holding the powerful to account. Or Jose Ruben Zamora in Guatemala. We've just been with his son in the US this week. So he also has faced these lawsuits and the shutting down of his newspaper. Second, I suppose, is lawfare, weaponising the law in different ways. So many people will be familiar with journalists being, for example, prosecuted with criminal libel or sued for defamation. But I think, Jen, you and I are seeing a real pattern of increasingly creative ways of the law being used to target journalists, so intellectual property laws, for example. One example is 2 Bloomberg journalists in Turkey were really ludicrously charged under the Capital Markets Act, not something you would usually expect to have to deal with as a media lawyer, because they wrote a piece about the collapse of the lira. So the argument was you've undermined the state and national security by writing about the economic reality. And Turkey, they were prosecuted. But also they're using laws to try to discredit people. So they call Maria Ressa a tax evader. They call Jose Ruben Zamora fraud. They call Jimmy Lai fraudulent. And that's designed to undermine people's faith in journalists and journalism. And third, I suppose, is the multiple cases at the same time. So having to fight on multiple different fronts, a kind of war of attrition. So rather than having one case to deal with, you've got to deal with multiple cases. Good example of that is Daphne Caruana Galizia, the assassinated journalist in Malta. Jen and I have the honour of representing her family. Mm-hmm. And at the time of her death, she was facing 48 different lawsuits, criminal and civil suits. So you see, it's designed just to drain your time and to stop you being able to do your job, to speak truth to power, to hold the powerful to account. And then the fourth one, I think, in this case is, it's really an attempt to rewrite history. Because what we saw in 2019, 2020, and some of you in the room may have been there for those protests, was a mass uprising by the public in Hong Kong. You had 1.7 million people taking to the street, for example, to Victoria Square in one of the protests. You had a situation where multiple people, huge swathes of the population, were in support of the protests, rather like what you see in Iran. But what the authorities are now attempting to do is to construct a false narrative which suggests this was only a fringe, small number of people funded by foreign actors, by foreign forces, the CIA, the West. And we're seeing a very similar thing with Iran. And look, you know, people have probably seen that Simpsons cartoon about Tiananmen Square, which has the Simpsons going to Tiananmen Square and seeing a plaque which says Tiananmen Square, on this date, on this space, In 1989, nothing happened. And that's really what we're seeing. And this whole trial is an attempt to pretend that somehow Jimmy Lai was just one of a small number of people who whipped up hatred against the authorities. It's completely, completely untrue. And unfortunately, that's a trend we're seeing in Iran and elsewhere.
Can you just quickly give an update on where Jimmy Lai's current trial is at?
Yeah, of course. So the trial started on the 18th of December 2023. So we're now into month 5. And this is a trial under the national security law and also sedition law. So it's a trial which is about his journalism, articles that were published that were critical of the authorities, and also about what they call collusion with foreign forces, which is his engagement with politicians, human rights organizations around the world, and indeed with the United Nations. So now in the new Hong Kong, engaging with the United Nations equals collusion with foreign forces. I'm colluding with foreign forces here, sitting with you, Ben, at the moment. So we've just come to the tail end of the prosecution part of the case. They're running very, very late. There is, coming up in a few weeks, an attempt by the defence to say there's no case to answer, a kind of halfway submission, which is highly unlikely to succeed. And then we're going to be into the defence case. So what we're likely to be seeing is this trial coming to an end and heading towards what is regrettably, almost inevitably, a conviction later this year. And I say almost inevitably a conviction because, Jen, as we know, and of course as Ben knows, the national security law has been designed to criminalise any kind of activity. And if you look at the numbers of people convicted under it, it's really deeply shocking, including very recently, of course, an Australian national.
Exactly. So one of the things that we've been doing in our international advocacy is engaging with UN experts and UN special procedures. And I want to acknowledge that Ben Saul is an independent expert appointed by the Human Rights Council to report around the world on the use of the abuse of counterterrorism laws and human rights. I want to make clear that he's independent of us on this panel and is going to give some prepared remarks in view of that.
Thanks very much, Jen, and good evening, everyone. And firstly, let me welcome you to our beautiful university in my capacity as a member of our governing Senate. I'm really pleased that Sydney University has had a long tradition of being a platform for enabling free speech, and in recent months, of course, I'm personally really proud of the stance our university has taken on the Gaza encampment on the front lawns, which disappeared recently. But the university has faced enormous pressures, political and from other quarters, and I think we got the balance pretty right in allowing people to speak their minds and stand for their principles, even if members of us individually may or may not have agreed. That's the point of safeguarding free speech. Next, let me, of course, welcome Sebastien and extend to you my solidarity and sympathy for the difficulty you and your family face in this case. I've got some prepared remarks because in this role I don't want to cause a diplomatic incident, and I've got to be a little bit careful.
We're happy to, but you can't.
Yeah, unlike as an academic where I can shoot my mouth off and there are no consequences. So far, only one country wants me sacked at the United Nations, but I don't want to add China to that list quite so early in my tenure. And Caoilfhionn, I'm glad China thinks the United Nations is so dangerous that it's banning foreign collusion with us. If anybody knew anything about the UN's budget and bureaucracy, you'd know we're not very powerful at the moment, that's for sure. You're also, Sebastien, in great hands with Caoilfhionn and Jen, who are, I know, incredibly relentless, determined, incredibly clever and strategic lawyers to have in your corner. So you're in great hands. Now, as United Nations Special Rapporteur, I cover 193 countries in terms of their human rights compliance when countering terrorism. We engage formally with governments through formal written communications and then dialogue with those governments, including actually the Chinese official in charge of human rights in Geneva, with whom I have a constructive dialogue, is a Sydney Law School graduate, actually. So it's an angle I'm working to remind and China of human rights principles. I mean, some of our other graduates actually went on to be coup leaders in Fiji, so we've got a mixed record at the law school. But look, I and other United Nations independent experts have repeatedly called on China to drop all charges against Jimmy Lai and release him immediately. Mr. Lai has spent decades campaigning for freedom of speech, press freedom and democracy in Hong Kong. His arrest, detention and harassment through criminal prosecutions over the past few years appear to be directly related to his criticism of the Chinese government and his support for human rights and democracy in Hong Kong. After being arrested in August 2020, his current trial, and of course there were earlier trials, involves charges under the 2020 Chinese national security law enacted by the Beijing authorities. He's been charged with sedition and conspiracy to collude with foreign forces. The charges relate to tweets, interviews and articles published in the Apple Daily about the negative impact, among other things, of the national security law itself on human rights in Hong Kong. Mr. Lai, as mentioned, could face life in prison if convicted. Now, his trial is the second under the national security law after last year's trial of 47 pro-democracy activists. 45 people were convicted and will be sentenced very soon in coming weeks or months. For, again, up to life imprisonment. They include legislators, students, activists and academics, including from the law school in Hong Kong. Hundreds more have been arrested under the national security law, including children. Now, as UN experts, we've been alarmed by the misuse of the criminal law to gravely violate Mr. Lai's freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association. We're further concerned about his fair trial rights, including the hand-picking of judges by the political authorities, the intimidation of his lawyers, and restrictions on his ability to be represented by a lawyer of his choice. The misuse of criminal proceedings against Mr. Lai also has a chilling effect on others in Hong Kong, including the media, political dissidents, legislators, human rights defenders, lawyers, students, bloggers, artists, the list goes on. They're trying to demonstrate that no one is too big to take down. It's a deliberate technique to change the governance system under the pretext of combating national security. And Hong Kong is obviously in an existential struggle for freedom. The United Nations Human Rights Committee, which monitors states' compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, has also raised concern about the excessive number of civil society organisations, including trade unions and student unions, which have relocated or ceased to operate since the enactment of the national security law. National security law and offences and arrest and detention under them should never be misused against those exercising their rights to freedom of expression and association and peaceful assembly. The broader concerns that UN experts have expressed about the 2020 national security law include, number one, the overbroad scope of crimes like secession, subversion, terrorism and foreign collusion, where the activities criminalised do not involve incitement to violence or other genuinely serious criminal harms. Secondly, consequent infringements on free expression, assembly and association and the right to participate in public affairs, including legitimate activities of civil society, flow from this misuse of the criminal law. Thirdly, the law contains provisions which undermine the independence of judges and lawyers, and so undermines the integrity of the legal system beyond the problems with the charges themselves. And fourthly, there's a possibility of transferring cases from Hong Kong to mainland China, which of course has a very different judicial system, although increasingly less different, and is not a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, unlike the Hong Kong region. Now, we emphasise in our communications that any restriction on freedom of expression on national security grounds must have the genuine purpose and demonstrable effect of protecting a legitimate national security interest, precisely and strictly defined. Freedom of expression protects speech that offends, shocks, disturbs or criticises government, as long as it does not amount to incitement to hatred, hostility or violence. Now, of course, just this year, we've had a second national security law enacted, which provides the authorities with an additional source of repression. This one has been enacted by the Hong Kong authorities themselves. Contains quite a bit of overlap in terms of the offences, but introduces on the books offences like treason, secession, sedition, subversion, insurrection, incitement to mutiny, revealing state secrets, sabotage, external interference, and collaborating with an external force. So if you didn't have enough under the previous law, you've certainly got enough now. Our concerns, and I led the UN communication on this some months ago, our concerns with this one, again, the offences are vague, overbroad, and don't satisfy the requirement that legal offences must be sufficiently precise so that people know the scope of their legal liabilities. Secondly, they undermine the various freedoms I've already mentioned: opinion, expression, assembly, association, movement, liberty, fair trial, privacy, participation in public affairs, academic freedom, media freedom, the list goes on. Thirdly, they criminalise and chill civil society, the media and human rights defenders. And as Caoilfhionn mentioned, criminalises potentially even engagement with people like me or other United Nations human rights procedures. It also increases penalties for offences in ways which are grossly disproportionate. At the procedural level, the law provides for excessive periods of pre-trial detention, and this is a technique that authoritarians use the world over. I mean, even if you don't eventually prosecute people, if you can put them in jail for months at a time, that often sends a chilling message to people not to speak out. The law enables the government to handpick judges in national security cases infringing judicial independence and impartiality. The law also restricts legal representation and choice of lawyers in violation of the right to fair trial. Now, China claims, and when we dialogue with them, they say, look, many common law countries have offences like this on the books, and that's true. I mean, here in Australia, we've got some offences which are named and in some ways look similar. The difference, of course, is in, as I mentioned, the integrity of the judicial system which applies those offences. And if you don't have judicial independence, if you don't have safeguards and protections of fair trial, then the way offences like that play out in a system like Hong Kong is quite different from how they would play out in Australia. You add to that lack of independence of prosecutors, the broad scope of these offences, which in some ways are much wider than other common law countries, and it is a recipe for repression. Hong Kong also lacks the human rights safeguards that you'd expect if you were applying national security offences of this kind. We've also been concerned that the law applies extraterritorially, enabling transnational repression to hunt down dissidents in other countries, including threats against people here in Australia. So to conclude, we as UN experts urge the Chinese and Hong Kong governments to urgently review both national security laws to ensure compliance with human rights law. As is our job, we offer our constructive technical assistance to that end, but we also urge other countries to raise their voices, to oppose the laws generally and their application in specific cases like Mr. Lai, to ensure that they don't cooperate in providing legal assistance or extradition to the Chinese government, and to be vigilant about efforts by the Chinese authorities to interfere here on our soil as well, because we know that that is happening in a number of countries as well. We need to raise the political costs and the political heat on China so that they don't think they can get away with this and that they can do it again to people other than Mr. Lai. Thanks very much.
Ben, I had two really quick questions before we come back to the others. Is first, which country has tried to get you sacked?
Yeah, that's a UN secret.
But I mean,
it's not going to work, by the way.
Of course not. But you are a world expert on counterterrorism laws and human rights and national security laws. How does what you're seeing in China compare to what we're seeing elsewhere on a spectrum of abusive national security laws?
So it's globally a massive and increasing problem. So after 9/11, 2 decades ago, the United Nations Security Council required all countries to adopt new counter-terrorism laws, and that really triggered a wave of incredible lawmaking, which then happened again when ISIS emerged in about a decade ago. Security Council pumped out a whole bunch of new resolutions. And so although countries, all countries have always had national security laws, they've always been abused by, bad authoritarian states. And so, one question is this just, new labeling? Is it nothing really different? I think the different thing is that because it's got the stamp of approval of the United Nations Security Council, a lot of states have felt like they can just get away with a whole lot of abuses, which they could never get away with to the same extent before. So I think it's a real wave of abuse. It started with terrorism. It then, about a decade ago, expanded to include violent extremism. Now it's including just extremism, even if it's not violent, and we're seeing that play out in suppression of media, suppression of all kinds of protest. I think we've seen that with Gaza recently.
So then I'd say quote unquote extremism.
Yeah, and look, it's in all regions. I mean, my predecessor did a global study last year on the misuse of counterterrorism and national security laws against civil society in every region in the world. This is a problem. I was in Kenya 2 weeks ago, and there were literally Kenyan government death squads going door to door. I was in a room of mothers in tears, recounting how just a few weeks ago these security forces would come in, throw some grenades through the door, murder their children, take the bodies of the dead husbands and throw them in the national park for the lions and the vultures to eat, so that there's no evidence left. So this is endemic. It's getting worse because of and this goes back to the China point. Because of the geopolitics, there's a real sense of attack on the universality of human rights globally at the moment. And because of all kinds of other geopolitical forces, I think lots of countries are not pushing back as hard as they should be to defend the multilateral human rights system. Just a couple of months ago, the UN regular budget of the UN system had only received 17% of the funding committed by states for the past year. So if you go to the UN in Geneva, and this is not just human rights, this is across the system, the escalators are switched off because the UN can't pay the electricity bill. The lights are turned down, the heating is switched off. I've got a hiring freeze. Some of my country visits have been cancelled. There's just no money. So I feel like at a time when we need multilateralism more than ever, because this is feeling increasingly like a 1930s moment. We're defunding the multilateral institutions that can do the work to protect things like human rights or peace and security or disarmament or whatever is the collective problem we face.
Sebastien, I want to come back to you because you are now living outside of Hong Kong and can't return, so you haven't been able to see your dad. And you've made a decision to commit yourself to doing this international campaigning for your dad's freedom. Talk about what it is that you've been doing in the campaigning work and some of the blowback that you've received because of this work.
Yeah, so essentially we've been trying to shine a light on what is happening to my father and the people of Hong Kong. And part of that is obviously doing media, but also meeting with politicians and putting pressure on the Hong Kong government. And we've been, I would say, relatively successful. The US government has called for his release, the British government has called for his release, both Canadian houses, so Parliament and Senate have called for his release, the European Union has as well as multiple UN special rapporteurs, and we've been incredibly grateful for that and for the moral clarity that these organizations have shown. As a result of that, I can't go back to Hong Kong. Obviously, I haven't seen my dad in 3 years. You you could say it's a different Hong Kong, but for me it's still home. But I think for a man like my father always liked to say that fear is the cheapest weapon that they have, that an autocratic regime has on its people, on everybody. Once you fear them, they could cow you. And in this situation, it's my father's life, so even though I am scared sometimes, I'm not going to stop until I see him out.
I think it's incredibly brave of you to do so. And Caoilfhionn, can you speak a little bit? Ben mentioned the threats towards us as lawyers and towards Sebastien for his engagement at the UN. Can you explain a little bit more about what's going on as part of the broader trend of transnational repression we're seeing from countries like China?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I do want to start by acknowledging my privilege and your privilege, Jen, in that, because we're obviously we're based in London, in Australia, in Ireland. We're based in countries outside Hong Kong. We don't have family members in Hong Kong. I'm acutely conscious and think all the time about the bravery of Sebastien speaking out for his father, the bravery of so many Hong Kongers. We've all seen the videos of Hong Kongers standing in the rain using their smartphones as makeshift candles on the last night of printing of Apple Daily. We're all aware, I know there's many people in the room who will have been personally affected and will have potentially had threats to them and threats to family members in Hong Kong. So I just start by saying that, because what's happened to us is horrific, but it's nothing compared to what Hong Kongers go through around the world. And indeed, I'm acutely conscious here in Australia, as you alluded to, there's two people here in Australia who have bounties on their heads simply because of their pro-democracy views. So two Australian residents who have bounties on their heads, which mean that there's a very large amount of money available if they're captured and handed to the authorities. And the chief executive of Hong Kong has referred to them as rats who should be hunted down across the globe. In terms of what's happened to us on the legal team, it's been referred to within the UN system and in the UK Parliament, and we're grateful for that. It's a range of things. So simply for acting in the case, we've been threatened. There's been hit pieces in Chinese state media. We've been called enemies of the people. We've been threatened with prosecution for doing our jobs. Jen and I were subjected to very intimidatory physical surveillance by someone connected to the Chinese state, following us around the building at the United Nations in Geneva, photographing us, very intimidating. We've been multiple attempts to kind of hack our bank accounts, hack our emails, etc., and a lot of cyber harassment. And it's often targeted. So on a day which is very important for the case, you kind of wake up to multiple rape threats, threats of dismemberment, a notification from your bank that there's been an attempt to hack your bank account, and so on. And it all happens. It's rather like that whack-a-mole strategy I was talking about earlier. We get that too. But on a slightly lighter note, because I appreciate this is rather grim, what we're talking about, the security authorities in the UK spoke to us about some things we needed to be aware of. And one of the things they warned us about was that if we had children who play online games, there's a tactic of trying to get to your kids and then through that get to your numbers and so on. So I had to sit down my kids to talk to them about this, and they said, do any of your children play Roblox or Fortnite? You need to talk to them. So I have a 13 and an 11-year-old son. They play Fortnite and Roblox. So I had to sit down to explain to them these warnings and ask them if they'd had any strange activity when they were playing computer games. And one of my sons went rather quiet and then said, is there someone from the Chinese government who gets paid to play Fortnite and Roblox all day? You could certainly see him thinking, this sounds like a great career opportunity. So I'm not sure that was quite the intended. But look, I mean, the serious point is, what we're now seeing is that China and Hong Kong are no longer content to try to silence critics within their own borders. They're now determined to use the long arm of the state to try to silence critics wherever in the world they may be, whether they're the two Australian residents who are here, whether they're an Australian national, Jen, as an international lawyer doing her job at the United Nations, whether it's a son speaking out for his father. It is disgraceful bully tactics that we're seeing, and we have got to call it out.
Go Go ahead, Ben.
Can I just add one point on that is, with counterterrorism law after 9/11, I mean, it used to be the case that national security laws were primarily territorially focused. But what happened with Security Council resolutions post 9/11 was that it kind of unlocked it to be okay to apply national security laws extraterritorially. And that's where a new kind of site of abuse has emerged, I think, and it's not just China. I mean, you guys have had cases, BBC Persian, Iran International, where counterterrorism law is being applied globally against journalists and their families. We see cases of, and those were cases also where there have been physical attacks, of course, as another part of transnational repression. Iran, Russia, I'm looking at some Sikh cases without naming any state at the moment in a number of countries. So I think this is, and the more states like ours don't call that out and don't push back against that, the more normalised it becomes, and the more acceptable it is for other states to go down that path. And so that's why I'm really concerned when our government, our government's not speaking of any in particular, don't step up and defend human rights at every possible opportunity in the UN, unilaterally, in bilaterals, because it creates this enabling environment for that kind of repression to flourish.
Yeah, I agree. Could I add just one quick thing on that? People will obviously be aware of some of the really emblematic high-profile cases like Jamal Khashoggi being dismembered in the Saudi consulate in Turkey, a Washington Post journalist, or the Ryanair plane being hijacked by Belarus to literally bring a journalist within jurisdiction to try to prosecute them. So I think this extraterritorial issue, it's a growing trend, deeply concerning. Jen and I act for Iran International, as you mentioned. One of our clients was stabbed in London in broad daylight on Good Friday of this year by people who flew in, organised crime groups who were proxies for Iran, who flew in, stabbed him and left via Heathrow within a number of hours. So this is a huge problem, and China is one of the worst perpetrators of it.
And I think there's a lot of concern here in Australia about that too, about activities. We've got a bunch of questions that were submitted through registration. Did you want to ask them, Melanie, or would you like me to?
So there were some, thank you to those who submitted questions. I'm happy for you to ask them. I'm just wondering if there's also going to be any questions from the, time for any questions from the floor. I don't know if there's anyone who has any questions here. No, otherwise we can go to the ones that were asked on registration. Off you go.
Okay, so is there enough momentum or interest in Australia to stand up for justice for Mr. Lai?
I've just arrived today. There you go.
So hopefully by the end of the week,
I've been incredibly touched, and I've just been incredibly touched by the support that we've been getting in Australia. It's actually a funny story. So, actually, it's not that funny, but just thinking about it. But in the UK, in my advocacy, I have this. This bit where I tell if I meet a politician, I tell them my father's story, why he's doing what he's doing, why it's important, whatnot. And in the UK, he's a British citizen, right? So it always plays out, and then at the end, it's like, they feel sorry for me, or whatever it is, right? But I always felt like I had to justify myself in the UK. And then there was one day I met a Australian politician, a very high-level politician, and he stops me midway, which I was surprised about. Nobody had done that before, and I thought it was quite rude. But he says to me, Sebastien, I know your father's story. He's a good guy, and I'm on side. And at that moment, I almost teared up, because it was such a clear example of just how simple my father's story is. Like someone who has essentially given everything he has to stand up for the freedoms of his people, someone who could have fled, or worse yet, extracted resources from his home city and gone to Britain or wherever to retire in comfort, decided to stay there with his people, to go to the protests every day. I remember Dad coming back home one day covered in pig entrails. Someone had saw him and threw pig entrails on him. And I still remember him, we were all freaked out because it was on the news, and we all thought something very bad had happened to him, but he just comes in smelling horribly. And he looks at us, smiles and says, "Oh, I guess I got to take a shower." And he took a shower and was straight back out again. So, yeah, long story short, we've been very grateful for the support in Australia, and hopefully we'll drum up some more.
I suppose I would say we hope so, and we should expect support in Australia. I mean, there's 86,000 people born in Hong Kong who've made Australia their home. You've got direct attacks on Australians by Hong Kong. We've obviously had attacks on Australians and on Australian free speech by China. Australia managed to bring Cheng Li home relatively recently, and we obviously saw what happened when the Chinese Premier was here. Yet another example of extraterritorial targeting. We've seen Chinese police stations proliferate worldwide, attempting to terrorize diaspora communities. We've got to stand up to it. But also we've got 900 members of the Chamber of Commerce, the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Hong Kong. So multiple people who've decided to invest in Hong Kong or to do business in Hong Kong. And this is a cautionary tale. We've had state-sponsored theft of a business here, state-sponsored theft of a media company, because the authorities don't like this man's opinions. That's what we've had. We've seen multiple attempts to intimidate businesses. Every single Australian who is running a business or operating in Hong Kong needs to watch out. This case should warn them that they need to watch out. And it's really in Australia's interests to stand up for this. And of course, as well, what Jimmy Lai stands for are Australian values that Australia holds dear. So as a matter of principle, it's important that Australia speaks out, but also as a matter of pragmatism to protect Australian interests and Australian people.
We're running out of time, but I'm going to ask two last questions. Would Mr. Lai's legal team do whatever it takes to get him out of jail, and what is your bottom line?
That's like a strange question. I'm not quite sure. Well, I suppose what I would say is, in all of these cases which involve arbitrary detention that Jen and I do, it's all really about working out what the leverage is, because bottom line is we are no longer dealing with a rule of law compliant place. So we know that they're not going to comply with international law standards. And of course they aren't. The national security law itself isn't compliant with international human rights standards. So in every single case where we've got arbitrary detention like this, it's all really about the hassle factor. How do you make it more hassle for the repressive state in question to continue targeting the person rather than just letting them go? So it's all about that. And actually a key thing here is the rule of law piece, because we know that Hong Kong and China really care about presenting Hong Kong as somewhere where it's safe to do business. That's the narrative that they want to put out there. It's also one of the reasons why I and many others are concerned about foreign judges continuing to sit in Hong Kong, because it gives a fig leaf or a veneer of respectability to a system which does not deserve it. And can I just give you a statistic on that? 5 years ago, in June 2019, there were 26 political prisoners in Hong Kong. The most recent figures from April of this year, April 2024, 1,841. And that's a 7,000% increase in a period of 5 years. There are only 2 other countries in the world which have figures like that, a trajectory like that. And they are Belarus and Myanmar. Now, I think when you're dealing with, Jen, when we're dealing with cases involving, say, Iran or Russia or Saudi Arabia, or when you're dealing with Belarus or Myanmar, people understand they're dealing with kind of pariah states and states that are not rule of law compliant. The difference with Hong Kong is the golden blindfolds, the fact that people still seem to think they're dealing with a country which is rule of law compliant when it is anything but. And we've got to start seeing it for what it is. And it is in the category of those kind of countries: Saudi Arabia, Iran, Russia, Belarus, Myanmar. That's what Hong Kong has now become in a very short space of time.
Which is terrifying. Final question, how do we connect to support the case?
Oh, so you can follow along at Support Jimmy Lai on the X page or the at Support Jimmy Lai website. And please do, because it's by shining a light on what is happening to both my father and the people in Hong Kong that we can hope to get them out of prison.
And before we wrap up, we've got these signs here, which you can see online. Oh, sorry, that's my microphone. For those who are willing to hold it up, we'd love to get a photo of everybody holding it up. If you don't want to be photographed, don't be in it or cover your face. But we'd love a group photo of people holding it up. And if you'd like to take a picture of yourself, a selfie of yourself, and post it online, we would also be really grateful. So. Are you happy for people to do it? You've got them behind.
I've got one here, yeah.
Yeah, there you go. Keelan, how do you want to do it?
Yeah, sure.
Keelan, do you want everyone to come
stand
down
there?
here?
What do you
Like,
or do we stand
together or just sit up?
Why don't you ask people who are willing to come up at the front?
Yeah.
Oh, no,
For those,
well, actually, do we do it the other way around where we're standing here and people? I don't know. Okay, up to you.
how do you want to organise it? I don't know. How would you like to do this?
You guys go and stand in front, we'll take the photo.
Yeah, I want.
Okay.
Yeah.
What?
Just got to work out what the fine is. Thank you.
No, we're sitting like that. Oh, no.
All right, everybody hold them high.
Here with people turning, there's a nice perspective.
Oh.
That's not a bad idea.
Okay, I'm going to do both. Everybody hold them up. Beautiful. All right, I'm going to run up the stairs now.
Turn your side, look up this way. That's a nice perspective.
Great idea, thank you.
This is good audience participation.
Great, well done. Love it. Thanks. I didn't even think of that.
Thanks a lot.
Anyway, thanks to everyone for coming. Please give everybody a round of applause.
Yeah, and please, yes, and a special applause to our incredible panel. There will be a recording of this, and we might even have Ben's, Professor Saul's speech available. I will email the people who have registered with those details. But thank you so much. I hope you continue to support the Sydney Peace Foundation as well at the university. We have Peace Week in November, and this year the recipient is the International Red Cross and the Red Cross movement for its work in peace, humanitarian aid and international law. So thank you again everyone for coming, and thank you panellists.